There were probably more areas where I had deficits than there are areas where I actually had strengths. I think the one area I felt confident in was my ability to evaluate what big league baseball looks like. I'd spent so much time on the playing field. I had a pretty strong and firm idea of the type of team I want out on the field and what the style and character of the group should be, what winning baseball looks like. But there's so many aspects to that, and there's so many ways and contributing factors to build that team. And many of those I had no experience in. I don't have any experience in amateur scouting. I have no experience in professional scouting. I certainly had no experience in analytics or R&D, no experience in international scouting, and I really didn't know most of the nuances and intricacies of the rules in the baseball operation. I could go in a clubhouse and feel very comfortable and walk into the manager's office and discuss the game, but all these other areas that you need to know that contribute, they weren't areas of expertise for me, and I'd still say they're not.
That was Chris Young. He's one of the few people to win a World Series both as a player and general manager. He pitched in the major leagues for 13 seasons and helped the Kansas City Royals win the World Series in 2015. Recently, he became the GM of the Texas Rangers, even though, as you just heard him say, he lacked experience in most areas of baseball operations. But in year one as GM, the Rangers won their first World Series in franchise history. Today, we'll discuss his unusual path to get here, and we'll explore how his team was able to achieve their ultimate goal.
Champions aren't born, they're built. This is Deconstructing Champions, a podcast that explores the art and science of winning to help you elevate your game in sports, business, and life. And now, your host, four-time World Series champion and founder of Four Rings Sports Solutions, Zach Scott.
There's really no better person than Chris Young for my first podcast interview, and I say that for a couple of reasons. One, obviously because he's the architect of the reigning champs, which is what I want to explore with this podcast, the various ways to achieve your ultimate goals. And two, my company, Four Rings, consulted with CY and his baseball ops team throughout all of 2023. I enjoyed that experience because we have similar values and leadership philosophies. He's got a great group of people around him, and obviously because, well, they want it all. In this episode, we'll learn why manager Bruce Bochy was the ideal partner for CY, how the adversity he experienced professionally and personally as a pitcher shaped him as a GM, and how today's analytical tools would have increased his industry value as a player. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Chris Young. Hey Chris, welcome to the show. Thanks for being my first ever podcast guest.
Honored to be on here and looking forward to chatting with you.
I think if people do know who you are, they probably know some things about you. They know that you're really tall. That you're 6'10", and that maybe they know that you're a basketball and baseball star at Princeton and had a chance possibly to play in the NBA, right, with Sacramento, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. A lifetime ago, it feels like, but yeah.
So the one thing I'm curious if you even know that you're the first person in over 50 years to win a World Series, both as a player and as a GM, something you have in common with Stan Musial.
Wow. No, actually, I was not aware of that. That's pretty remarkable. I had no idea. There have been a lot of former players who have been GMs, and wow, that's very humbling.
So we'll talk about the Texas Rangers, the current team, obviously the run to winning the World Series in 2023. But I think what's interesting to me, especially about your career, is obviously what we just said, right? That you won a championship as a player, you had a very successful pitching career in the big leagues, and then you made a transition. And pretty quickly rose to the number one spot running an organization. I want to start with, though, talking about you as a player. So just, real quick on background. Obviously, you were drafted in 2000 by the Pirates, traded a couple times before making your big league debut in 2004 with, I'm assuming, the team that you rooted for, your hometown team of Texas Rangers.
Right, the Rangers.
Being that you're from the Dallas area, what was it like to debut with the Rangers?
For me, I thought, this is unbelievable. I'm getting to go home, and this is the way my career is supposed to be scripted, and that I'm going to go home and spend 10 plus years pitching for the team I grew up rooting for. And came back here as a Ranger, went to AA, was elevated to AAA in the summer of 2004. And then in August of 2004, made my debut for the Rangers in old the ballpark in Arlington, and the stadium I grew up going to Ranger games. And so it was an unbelievable experience. It was also the most nervous I had ever been in my life, debuting in front of countless friends and family. And at that point, I realized the pressures that come along with playing at home, especially as a young player. I think if it had been a different point in my career, I would have been more equipped to handle it. But I truly felt more pressure than I'd ever experienced in my entire life. It's hard enough just to pitch in the big leagues, much less to do it in front of friends and family, many of whom I had never failed in front of. And as we all know, one of the most challenging aspects of being a major league player is that everybody fails. It's inevitable that at some point you experience failure. And for me, going through really true failure in the public spotlight and eye for the first time in front of friends and family, there were challenges that I didn't anticipate that came along with that. So while it was an absolutely memorable and great experience and a dream come true in a lot of ways, there was also added pressures that I probably would not have had if I had debuted elsewhere.
I wanted to mention a quick story. In your third start is when you got your first win. It was against the Red Sox in Fenway Park. My Red Sox. I was working as a baseball ops intern that season. Happened to be on the radar gun that day. Back then, it wasn't automated. You put the velocity on the board. You'd push a button that had the pitch type. So that's what I was doing for most games at home, and that's what I was doing the day that you made your Fenway debut and ended up beating us. But there's two things that stood out for me that day. One was, the late great Tim Wakefield started for us. He was great for us, but quite honestly, wasn't the most fun to be on the radar gun for. You just kind of wear out that knuckleball button. So that was one thing that stood out about that game. But more importantly, I remember, we lost that game. We made a comeback late. You only gave up 2 hits against us. We tried to make a comeback. I think Bellhorn hit a grand slam or something late, and then we still ended up losing like 8-6 or something like that. After the game, I remember our assistant GM, Josh Burns, just being really pissed that we lost, and especially talking about, we lost this rookie who's just on his third start. He's only throwing, you're probably like at 91 maybe that year, low 90s that year?
Yeah, low 90s.
Yeah, and so you're 6'10", you're expecting him to come out throwing 98, and here you are sitting in the low 90s, and later much of your career's fastball was in the mid to high 80s, right?
Yeah.
So I just remember that because he was so upset about it, and then of course you go on to have a good career, so it doesn't feel so bad in the end. But those two things stood out. So the reason I bring it up is really that second point about how you were able to succeed without velocity. And I think in today's game, we do talk a lot about the tracking data. Every team seems to have a pitch stuff model, and there's some available publicly out there. You were kind of ahead of your time in the sense that you were having success pitching up in the zone with your fastball. You really backspin the fastball. Can you talk a little bit about your style of pitching and why you were able to have success with a lower velocity most of your career?
Yeah, Zach, and I'll do my best to explain it without still having full comprehension as to what the specific characteristics that made me so successful. I do know, based on later in my career, I did have a very high spin rate, and so I know that was a contributing factor. But yes, velocity was not a strength of my game. I think there was probably a perceptive velocity where the ball felt faster or harder than maybe I was throwing it, but you wouldn't look at me and I wouldn't jump off the paper as somebody that had great stuff, so to speak. And so what were the other attributes or characteristics that made me successful? And I don't think I can tell you every contributing factor. Aside from I attacked the strike zone for the most part, I think I threw well up in the zone at a time at which maybe we were taught to pitch down more. And I had a high spin rate, probably a little bit of a unique release point and angle to the ball. And it made it hard for hitters, especially the first or second time through the order, to really get comfortable. And then by the third time, when they started to adjust, I'm at the end of my game. So, and coming out at that point. So it's kind of interesting. I'm sure I was at a point where obviously velocity was measured frequently. It was really the only metric that you had to go off of, at least live, in terms of evaluating a pitcher or his stuff. And if I had been 10 or 15 years earlier than I was, and there really wasn't a radar gun in every stadium, what would that have looked like in terms of the evaluation? And would I have been more common, actually? Because I think there were probably other pitchers that, 15 years before me, my guess is they pitched similar to the style I had, but maybe We just couldn't measure it as well. The radar gun was the first thing that kind of came into baseball where you could quantify aspects of a pitcher's success or lack thereof. And then obviously it's come a long way with where it is today and all the metrics that we have to evaluate pitchers and make predictions.
Yeah, I think we have a much better understanding today. If Chris Young was coming up now, we'd understand the whys more than maybe we did back then. Some people who maybe listening to this might not know. You were kind of the anti-FIP pitcher in a lot of ways. So fielding independent pitcher. The theory for our audience is that pitchers didn't really have control over the ball once it was put in play. The key metric usually used is batting average on balls in play, or BABIP, and you had a career BABIP of 255. Spanning your career, it was probably 290 on average or something around there. But to put it in context, Mariano Rivera, who everyone talked about having this ridiculous cutter that would just break bats and no one could square it up, he actually had a 263 BABIP. You kind of reminded me of guys that I'd see later in my Red Sox years up close, really early. Like we had Keith Folk, who kind of lived similarly, high fastball, low changeup. Now most of these guys are relievers, so the fact you were doing this as a starter was really impressive. The other one, a few years later, is Koji Uehara. The same thing, right? Like not blowing away with velo, but using that fastball up in the zone, and in his case, the splitter down to kind of change eye levels. And hitters just didn't see that fastball, and it was because he was backspinning it quite a bit, and he could control it pretty well. Did you watch anyone growing up that was of an influence as a pitcher?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zach, and I did. And the funny thing is that I know that I didn't throw hard, but I actually threw every pitch that I can remember in my career with 100% conviction. And if you asked me how hard I was throwing, I would throw it with the confidence that I was throwing it in the mid 90s. And maybe that was just my own delusion in thinking that I could throw hard. But I knew when I threw the ball right and with conviction, even if it was only 88 miles an hour, there was something there that made it play up. And so I watched pitchers that were similar in that regard that really got good four-seam backspin and whip. And actually, my rookie year, it was 2005. And I remember the Red Sox came to Arlington, and I was in the weight room, and Curt Schilling came in, and he jumped on the exercise bike next to me. And Schilling was one that I always looked at. I loved the style of pitcher he was. I didn't have a split like he did, but the four-seam fastball and the way he threw it, it really kind of resonated with me. And I remember asking him what his mentality. I asked one question to Curt, what his mentality was when he threw his four-seamer. And he said something and described a feeling that really resonated with me. And I'm going to try to demonstrate it on camera. But he said every pitch that he throws, he's thinking of creating a whip or a feeling where the ball's coming off his finger and he feels something like that. And it's really backspinning the ball and getting through the ball. And that was the same mentality that I had. And once I heard it from him, it became an even higher priority for me of really trying to spin the ball. And another sort of anecdote that I have was when I was in the minor leagues, I was in the stands charting one day, and it was in Double-A. And there was an old scout seated next to me. I don't know his name. I didn't know what organization. And he looked at me and he said, "Son, you're going to be a really good pitcher one day when you learn one thing." And I said, "What's that, sir?" And he said, "When you learn to spin the baseball." And I didn't really understand what he meant, but over time it kind of became clear to me between conversations like that or the Curt Schilling conversation where spin mattered. And if you could spin the ball, it created some sort of perceived effect to hitters that they really struggled with.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think a lot of people probably hear that and think, spinning the ball is, throwing a curveball, throwing a slider, and they don't associate it enough with the fastball and kind of that backspin, that whip that Schilling talked about. And he's another good example of a guy, obviously with higher velocity, but it still played up that fastball when he'd throw it up in the zone. It is interesting because a lot of things happen in baseball these days where we talk about things as if they haven't been a thing for a long time. It's like they didn't exist before tracking did, right? So we started tracking batted ball data. People are starting to talk about fly ball revolution. Like, we didn't know that hitting the ball hard in the air was a good thing,
Right.
outcome for a hitter, right? That's how you hit home runs when it was strained. But with pitchers, it's the same thing. Schilling's a good example.
Yeah.
Pedro Martinez. I grew up watching Roger Clemens, and if you go watch his first 20 strikeout game, it's amazing he did it twice and so far apart. His first one against the Seattle Mariners in '86. He's throwing a ton of elevated fastballs. At that time, his curveball was his big secondary pitch. Later on, it was a splitter. But there are plenty. Nolan Ryan, someone from your neck of the woods, right? So these guys had this drop and drive. In Pedro's case, he was shorter, where they had fairly low release point, but they were backspinning this fastball, and it looked probably most likely they would have popped on those kind of metrics today. But it's funny, a lot of people will talk about the game the last 5 years about how all these pitchers throw up fastballs up in the zone, and it's definitely increased. But I'm not sure that's that revolutionary. I think we're better understanding what actually succeeds. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, 100%. There's certain things that have always been in the game. We just have better tools now to identify them, explain them, and as I said, make better predictions on players based on the tools we have. And it's the beauty of our game is that it continues to evolve, and we have more information at our disposal. But it does really highlight some of the things that have always been around and players have always done that maybe we couldn't explain. And now we have the metrics and tools and data to suggest these were the unique characteristics that made certain guys successful. It's our jobs, and you obviously have the same experience in the front office. Our jobs are to find the outliers. The outliers become big leaguers. That's really what it is. It's not the normal pitchers or players that become big leaguers. It's the outliers that do something exceptionally well more often than not that become the good big leaguers.
That's a good point. Moving on to talk about more of your career. So like I said before, I want to talk about Bruce Bochy, and I want to talk about some other managers, coaches that may have had an influence on you. And obviously, Bochy being a huge part of being the manager of the World Series champs for the Rangers for this past year. So you got to San Diego to play for Bochy. Texas traded you. So you go after a couple of years. You go from your hometown team to the Padres. How did that feel to get traded away from the team that you were so excited to pitch for?
I had been traded twice in the minor leagues at that point, and so I was obviously accustomed to the business aspect of the sport and being traded. I hadn't been traded at the big league level, and being traded by my hometown team, where, as I said, I thought I was going to spend my entire career, was a little bit of a shock to me. It really hurt. It was painful. My wife and I had just gotten married. We had bought in a home and here in Dallas, and I had a good rookie year. In fact, I think I tied a Rangers rookie record for wins for a starting pitcher with 12, and then got traded that offseason. And as I look back on it, it was the best thing that happened to me in my career. Getting traded to a better pitcher environment, going from Texas to San Diego. Petco Park was known as being one of the best pitchers parks in the big leagues. Getting away from just the friends and family aspect that I had referenced earlier, the pressures that existed with pitching at home. And I think most importantly, going to a winning team, a winning environment, a team that was coming off a division championship and was looking to win again. And it was just a great experience for me. And it did. It took me to play for what's going to become a Hall of Fame manager in Bruce Bochy. That year playing for Boch in 2006, it was the only year I got to play for him. After the 06 season, he left and went on to the Giants. However, the lessons I learned and the takeaways I had from playing for Boch, even as a young player, stuck with me and really shaped me the rest of my career, not only as a player, but certainly in this executive role.
What were some of the things about him that made him unique, and what were some of those takeaways, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. The things that stood out then were just his humility combined with his competitive intensity. He had a great disposition and demeanor in terms of being very approachable, but you knew he was highly competitive, and that nobody took that for granted. When you'd hear him roar at the end of the dugout when something didn't go well, you knew Boch meant business, and you didn't want to piss him off. But he also cared about you, and you knew he had your back. He would defend you. He'd care about you, and so it was this unique balance of being able to push you, being upset at times when things didn't go well, but also knowing that he wanted the best for you. He wanted the best for the team. I felt like it brought out the best in me. And there was really one experience that stood out. It was in the playoffs of 06. I started game 3 in St. Louis, and we were down 0-2 in the series. And then I think in the 5th inning, and maybe in the 6th inning, I hadn't given up a run. I think we were winning 2-0 at the time. I had 1 out and 2 runners on base, and Albert Pujols coming up to bat. And I looked over at the dugout, and Boch came out of the dugout. And so I assumed he was coming to get me, which he had all season. Anytime he came to the mound, he took the ball. And we had a very good bullpen. I couldn't argue with the call. And in fact, in today's game, I think it's a no-brainer that in those situations, you go to the pen. Boch got to the mound, and he looked me in the eye and said, "CY, you're a big reason we got here this year. This is your game. Go get this guy." And he left me in the game, and I'm telling you, I felt 10 feet tall at that point. Like, there is no way Albert Pujols is getting a hit right here. And I struck out Albert and was able to get Jim Edmonds out behind him and got out of the inning. And it was just magical, his feel in the moment to come out, say the one thing that made me feel great about myself. And in turn, we won the game when he could have easily taken the ball from me and gone to the bullpen. So just a great feel for people is what stands out the most. And he has not lost that at all. In fact, it's even better now.
That's what I was going to ask. When you ended up bringing him out of retirement to be the manager of the Texas Rangers, why was he the guy?
There were a lot of contributing factors, but most importantly, I remembered my experiences playing for him in 2006, but this was really 17 years later, 2023. And so I didn't want to assume that he was the same person or the same manager, had the same style. I had a pretty good feel that there's not a ton that had changed in a negative way, that in fact it had probably gotten better, but we needed to go through a process and make sure of that. And we did. Over the course of that interview process, it became very clear to me and to our executive group and ownership group that Boch fit all the criteria we were looking for in our next manager. And primarily, we needed somebody who had experience. And that was very clear to me. I was new at the job. It was my first year in the number 1 seat, and I was going to need somebody who could handle things in the clubhouse. I did not think I was the right person to develop a first-time manager. So that was a big part of it. Then secondly, just the credibility and the experience for what I believed was going to be a somewhat veteran group. We had a right mix of veteran players with some up-and-coming young players, and we needed somebody who could really create standards, expectations, accountability, and an environment to get the best out of all of these people, many of whom, especially the young guys, had not experienced a winning environment at the big leagues yet. So a calm, steady presence, but with that, again, competitive intensity and fire was something that we had highlighted in our criteria. And obviously, Boch brought all of that and more.
That's really interesting. All those things that you described is how he would come off just watching games. I remember watching Giants games and just this calmness, but also get fired up sometimes. Everything you described is he shows it. It's a sign of a very authentic human being.
He absolutely is. And one of the amazing parts, one of the questions that I needed answered in the search process was what his views are on today's game. I played for him a long time ago, and how has he evolved with today's game? He had been out in 3 years, and as we know, 3 years in some ways can be a lifetime. It can be a whole cycle of players at the big league level. It became very clear. In fact, Boch kind of beat me to the punch in the question he asked me, and how good is your analytics department? How good is your R&D team? How do you support the coaching staff with information? And the fact that he cared about that he wanted that, I felt like there was really, really strong alignment in terms of us both feeling strongly that analytics and information is a critical part of today's game. And we want to be as good as any team in baseball in that area, while also recognizing it's not the only factor or aspect to today's game, and that there's a balance. And Boch, his job, my job, all of our jobs is to synthesize and then apply the information as best as possible. But when he asked me that question, I knew this is somebody who's very open-minded. He wants to make very good decisions, and he's going to use the tools that we have available to him to help put these guys in the best position to succeed. And that alignment was critical, and I was really excited to hear that from him, because until we discussed it, I wasn't sure.
And like you said, everything's changed so much, changes rapidly. So for him to have that mindset where he wants to be able to utilize everything. That's part of his competitiveness, right? Like he wants to use everything to his advantage to try to make the best decisions in game and win as many games as possible. So besides Bo, do you have any other mentors and coaches along the way that impacted you long term?
Yeah, I've had so many, Zach. Just thinking back, one, just all the managers for whom I played over the course of my career. I had some great managers with Buck Showalter and Bruce Bochy, and then I played for Terry Collins in New York and Lloyd McClendon in Seattle, and then Ned Yost, of course, in Kansas City, and won a championship with Ned, and Bud Black in San Diego as well. So, some really great baseball men, a number of great pitching coaches, and many other coaches throughout my career, all of whom have had an impact. And then, getting exposed to a number of great executives as well. Sandy Alderson was an executive in San Diego. Kevin Towers, of course, in San Diego. Then I got to play for Dayton Moore and in Kansas City. And then, the person who hired me here in Texas, John Daniels, JD had just taken over as GM in Texas and, in fact, traded me to San Diego. And for many years, I was bitter and still mad and resentful for that trade. Yet we, over time, mended the relationship. And then he ends up hiring me and becomes one of my biggest mentors in the game for 2 years learning under him. And so still a great friend and a great person. So that's the beauty of the game, is just having exposure to so many great people, and you can learn from everybody. And I'm very fortunate and grateful for all the executives and coaches, much less the teammates all of whom from whom I've learned as well.
As painful as that trade was for you, I'm sure it was just as painful for JD in a different sense that, he packaged you with Adrian Gonzalez to send to the Padres, and probably not his favorite trade of his career, but hey, everyone has them, so it happens.
None of us bat 1,000, right?
No, absolutely not. So when you were playing, did you ever think about what was going to be next for you? Or did you think about being a GM? Did you think about coaching? What was your mindset? Or were you just so focused on playing that you didn't think about it until the end of your career?
I never knew. I never really thought past being a player. And by the time I was done playing, I was 38, almost 39 years old, and I felt like I had this, as I call it, a master's degree in baseball. And so it was the most natural thing is to stay in the game. And even then I didn't know in what capacity. I felt like I needed a break from the playing field. So coaching probably wasn't going to be my immediate path. And I'd never worked in a front office, so I didn't know really what that looked like or where the best path in a front office would be. And that's when the commissioner's office called. And, I really started thinking through that and kicking the tires and understanding, maybe seeing the game through a different lens in the commissioner's office, maybe something that would open some doors and help me decide or figure out what the next step in my baseball career would be. And that's exactly what it did. And very, very grateful for the people at MLB who brought me in, who gave me a chance, who exposed me to so many different aspects of the industry. And really the relationships that I was able to forge in my time, my 2.5 years at MLB, working with really all 30 clubs and the baseball ops department and front offices and the on-field coaching staffs and managers. It gave me a great Rolodex and database of resources throughout the game.
So when you're at the commissioner's office and you decide you want to transition into a front office role, is that something you decided that you wanted to do, or was it just the opportunity presented itself?
Yeah, it was the opportunity more than anything. I didn't understand, nor did I think I was prepared. Honestly, I had relationships, but I didn't understand what a general manager position entailed and looked like on a day-to-day basis. After 2.5 years in the commissioner's office, there were a couple opportunities to interview for spots as a general manager. And one of those was Texas. And it was my hometown team. My wife and I and 3 children were actually living in Dallas at the time. I was commuting to New York for the commissioner's office job. And growing up a Ranger fan, I felt like there was no greater challenge and opportunity than to come back and help lead the Texas Rangers to their first ever World Series championship. And that was a huge factor in my decision.
You come in as the GM, JD's right-hand man, and then fairly quickly have to transition to be the number one person in that seat. I want to come back to that. I do want to touch a little bit on your the rest of your career. We kind of stopped. I want to make sure we touch on the Royals experience that you had. One of the things that's interesting about your story, what puts you in a unique position, unique meaning only 15, 20% of GMs are former players, big league players, that you've experienced so much. We've already talked about you've been traded multiple times. Obviously, you got drafted. You've experienced that. Towards the end of your time with the Padres, you missed a lot of time due to a shoulder injury.
Yeah.
So you've experienced that. Was there ever a time during that period where you thought your career might be over?
Absolutely. I always say that my career is not the way you'd script it by any stretch of the imagination. When I signed as a sophomore in college, I thought I'm going to go play 15 years for one team, have this storybook career and win multiple championships, and it's going to go just exactly how I want it. What I realized over time is that very few people have that opportunity, and for the rest of us, it's a little bit survival. For me, that's what it felt like, just year to year, coming back and fighting and clawing and doing the best I could to survive. And there were numerous times over the course of my career, whether it was performance-based or medically, where I felt like I was challenged and not sure of which direction the career would go. The biggest ones probably for me were the surgeries. And I had 3 shoulder surgeries over the course of my career, 2 of which I'd consider pretty major. One was a capsule surgery and the other was thoracic outlet syndrome. Those surgeries provided opportunities for me to overcome. And I can't lie and say there wasn't some doubt in knowing that, there's no certainty that you're coming back from surgery, but I was hopeful that if I worked hard, I, took things one day at a time and just focused on the short-term goals, that the long-term goals would work out and I'd make it back, and just continue to believe. And eventually it all worked out. I had the great fortune of being around some really good medical people and doctors and physical therapists who helped me as well. But ultimately, committing one day at a time to those rehabs allowed me to get back. And then once you get through it once, you realize, okay, I know what it takes. I can do this again, even though, it sucks to have to do it again. So by surgeries 2 and 3, I mentally knew what I was in for and just committed to it and was able to persevere. And, I think the life lessons I learned through that adversity was more important than anything I could have learned if I had had a smooth 15-year career the way I would have scripted it. So I wouldn't trade it for the world. I'm very grateful for the highs that I experienced and certainly the lows that I experienced and everything in between. It's taught me so much about myself. And then it's also given me a unique perspective for players. I feel like I've seen different aspects of this game, and I've been in their shoes, and I really know what they're going through, and hopeful to lend some advice and a helping hand to help them persevere and achieve their dreams and their goals and their careers.
Yeah, I think one of the first times that we spoke, I mentioned that I was jealous that you have this immediate credibility with players because you've gone through so much of the things that someone, if not all of them, are going to experience at some point in their career. So I just think it's a big advantage. And, you have this authority because you're 6'10". That's nice too.
I'm a big teddy bear. You know that.
So you do bounce back from the injuries and have some good years after that. You do bounce around, as you mentioned before. You bounce around to the Mets, the Mariners, before you land in Kansas City, which is ultimately where you finish your career. And your first year is 2015, the year that they win the World Series. Now, you start out in the bullpen that year. You hadn't really ever pitched out of the bullpen in the big leagues. I think you had one outing that you pitched out of the pen. Was that a difficult transition for you? I mean, that's quite a change after years of pitching as a starter.
Yeah, it was an unknown, but again, I had 2 mantras over the course of my career, and it took me about halfway through my career to realize it. There were times where I think I felt sorry for myself, as a lot of players do, and you worry about things that you can't control. And about halfway through my career, I had an epiphany that, one, this is a performance-based game, and secondly, the game owes you nothing. And when I started shifting my mindset to those 2 things, I realized that as long as I perform, I will earn whatever I get in this game. And if I don't like something, I need to perform better. And so I took that mentality and applied it to transitioning to the bullpen. Okay, it's different than what I've done in the past. I had my background as a starting pitcher, but at the end of the day, I got to go out and get 3 outs at a time, 1 inning at a time, get 3 outs. And it doesn't matter whether they're the first 3 outs or the last 3 outs of the game or anything in between. go out and get outs, and things will work out, and you'll have more opportunity. And that was the mentality. And for whatever reason, it was a very simple philosophy, simple mindset, and I think it served me well, at least for a year or two in the bullpen. My last 2 years, it didn't go as well, but the struggles were more physical than they were mental.
So you end up earning your way back into the rotation. You have one of your best seasons. The team ends up getting back to the World Series for their second straight time, your first time with them. And then you're a big part of it. I'm sure there's some Mets fans listening to this, given my background and history and yours as well. You were the winning pitcher of Game 1, that for them infamous game where Familia gave up the home run to Alex Gordon, right?
Right.
And you came in and pitched 3 hitless innings and earned the win in that Game 1, which was probably the most pivotal game. I mean, that series only went 5, but it was a lot closer because there were some games where the Mets had
extra inning games.
And there were some pen meltdowns, and or if you want to look at it positively, some good rallies to get back into it. You also then pitched again. You started a game later in that, pitched 4 solid innings in a game that another tough pen game for the Mets, but you guys ended up pulling out. So what were the takeaways from the whole experience of that first year with the Royals? You talked earlier about adversity in your career. Was there adversity with that team ultimately you overcame and were able to win? What was the story from your perspective and the takeaways from that experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there was really, as I look back on it, there was adversity on a couple different levels. The team went through some adversity over the course of the year. And then on a personal level, there was 2 different types of adversity that I faced. I'll start with that. The season before, 2014, I had pitched for the Seattle Mariners. I was coming off thoracic outlet syndrome surgery. And that year for the Mariners had a great year. I thought one of my better years, and won comeback player of the year for the American League in 2014. And so I went into the 14-15 offseason expecting to have opportunities. And as the offseason materialized, I didn't get any major league offers. They were only non-roster invitations, and I felt like I had just put up this great year where I threw, I can't remember, 160-something innings coming off surgery, and just had a tremendous year on a winning team and had no opportunities to sign a major league contract. I was very bitter. I was very resentful. I felt like it was the first time where those 2 mantras I had said earlier, it's a performance-based game and the game owes you nothing, were being challenged for me. And then all of a sudden, March 6th of 2015, I get a call. I was just about to sign a minor league deal with the Dodgers, and the Royals called and offered me a major league deal. Dayton Moore called and offered a major league deal, basically at the minimum. And I had the opportunity to go and join the Royals, but it was going to be in the bullpen, and it was going to be in a relief pitcher setting to start, with the idea that if somebody went down, I'd work my way into the rotation, or if I pitched well enough. So I'd say that was the first kind of adversity that I faced. I knew that, hey, I'm on the outside looking in terms of making the rotation. But again, just pitch well and it'll all take care of itself. The second personal adversity I faced that year came in the form of the very end of the season. My dad passed away right before the playoffs. It was the last week of the regular season, and he had been sick with multiple myeloma. It's a form of blood cancer, but he was doing okay. There was nothing to suggest he would take a turn for the worse, but he did. Had an adverse reaction to some of his medicines. And anyway, I lost him September 26th of 2015. So literally right before the playoffs. And so I had to go home, bury my dad, and then turn around and pitch in the playoffs. And so there was adversity in that regard as well. So, and in fact, 2 of my teammates that year, Edison Volquez and Mike Moustakas, also lost parents in the same year. So it was pretty interesting to have 3 players go through that all at once, and all within a couple months time period, towards the back half or the second half of the season. And then as a team, we got off to this great start, got a huge lead in the division, and really it looked like we were coasting to the playoffs. The Royals, if you remember, had been in the World Series and lost to the Giants in 7 games in 2014. So this was a team that had World Series aspirations and expectations. And then in the really, I think, late August, early September, the team really struggled, really went into a slump, and we lost our lead on home field advantage to the Blue Jays. They caught us in the standings, and at that point, we still had the division. I think we knew we were going to win the division, but we had our backs up against the wall, knowing that it was going to be hard to go into a playoff series in Toronto if we didn't have home field advantage. And in the end, we got hot the last week, finished strong, and ended up winning the best record in the American League to secure home field advantage. And I actually think that adversity served us really well as we got into the playoffs and carried us through. And certainly we did have home field advantage.
Would you say any of that adversity, whether it's the personal or the team-related circumstances, had any influence on you now today as general manager? Has it shaped you at all?
There's no doubt it has. I don't know if I can articulate fully in what regard or manner, but I think it certainly contributes to what I look for in players in terms of just the ability to handle adversity. And I think so much of this game is about that. Big leaguers are talented. They have a ton of talent, but how do they handle the external pressures and adversity? And really, what are the intangibles that the player possesses that is going to allow him to succeed in the toughest moments? Because I think we can all do well when things are going well or we're feeling good or the adversity isn't as strong. But when things get tough, how does the player handle it, both physically and mentally? And so I think those are things I value. I can't tell you how I value it as compared to other general managers or other front office executives, but I certainly recognize it. The other part of me that really reflects back on that 2015 team and other teams that I've been a part of, whether it's in the minor leagues or even high school teams that won championships, was just the overall culture and the camaraderie amongst the group. When you have the right group of guys, that when things get tough, they don't turn on each other. They actually come together even more and play for each other even more, and it allows them to get through the tough times. And that's something that stood out in the 2015 team, and it certainly stands out in the 2023 team with the Texas Rangers, because there was no shortage of adversity in the second half of our season, and this group found a way to persevere. It was really telling to me in terms of the character of the group during those moments.
Yeah, let's talk more about the 2023 Rangers team. We talked about it before. You're GM, but the number 2 person to JD. And after the 22 season, there's a change. JD's dismissed, and you slide into the number 1 spot. Were you ready for that?
No, just very frankly, I was not. It caught me off guard when it happened. JD, as I said, was a great friend and mentor. We had a great partnership, and I understand the ownership's reason for the change. And JD and I had discussions about his succession plan in time, but I was not anticipating nor hoping that it would happen at the time it did. And therefore, I didn't necessarily think I was ready for the position. JD and I, in our conversations afterwards, he said, "No, you can handle this. You're going to be fine." He was a great mentor even after he left in terms of helping me focus on things I needed to really concentrate, especially at that transition period where the organization was in a level of, we'll call it disruption or uncertainty. And at that point, you slowly go through one day at a time, and you've sat in the chair too, Zach. And I don't know if you felt like you were ready when you took over or started it. You know what you know, but there are aspects of the job that you just can't anticipate until you go through it. And it's certainly been a learning experience for me. That said, I've had a lot of help with the great executives around me who have helped me, great people within the organization who have really came together during that uncertainty. And then a lot of external people as well who I've been able to lean on and ask advice, yourself included.
Well, always happy to have those kind of conversations. Our paths are very different, obviously. With all of my baseball time being in a front office, you're never ready for that position because, like you said, you only know what you know. You can observe it, and I always sat close to the person in that seat, so I observed it in a tough market and a place where we were expected to compete and win. So that helps as much as it can, but until you're put in it, you don't quite know where the challenges are going to be. You can have ideas about it, but you'll figure it out once you get there. You'd only been in a front office for a couple seasons before getting into that role. Obviously been on the field for a long time. At some point, since no one's ready, throw you to the fire, man. Just get you'll figure it out. You get adjusted. You're a smart guy. You have the right values, and you work with the people around you to get the help that you need. As you started to learn over those previous 2 years, and then when you're thrust in this position, what were the biggest areas that you may have had deficits?
I think there were probably more areas where I had deficits than there are areas where I actually had strengths. And I said this before. The one area I felt confident in was my ability to evaluate what big league baseball looks like. I'd spent so much time on the playing field. I had a pretty strong and firm idea of the type of team I want out on the field and what style and character of the group should be, what winning baseball looks like. Um, but there's so many aspects to that, and there's so many ways and contributing factors to build that team, and many of those I had no experience in. If you think about it, I don't have any experience in amateur scouting. I have no experience in professional scouting. I certainly had no experience in analytics or R&D, no experience in international scouting, and I really didn't know most of the nuances and intricacies of the rules and the baseball operations. So I could go in a clubhouse and feel very comfortable and walk into the manager's office and discuss the game, but all these other areas that you need to know that contribute, they weren't areas of expertise for me, and I'd still say they're not. Now, my management style is that I want to have great people around me and empower them to do their jobs, and their job is to educate me, and my job is to ask questions and give a vision, set out a vision and goals, and then help them achieve those goals. But I think having the right people around me has been critical to our success.
It's interesting you mentioned knowing what a big league team looks like and what it looks like to win at the big league level. It's something I've thought about a lot over my career. Is I always felt like our best professional scouts were the ones that first did advanced scouting.
Mm-hmm.
Given at the Red Sox, we were always expected to win. We didn't always come through on that, but we were always trying to compete for a championship pretty much every year. The people that were doing the advanced work were so focused on big league opponents and down to so much detail that their brains are calibrated so well on what a good big league
Right.
player looks like or how big league baseball should be played. It can be a burnout job, those types of jobs. You're traveling with the team,
Yeah.
you're doing the advanced, especially the old way we used to do it. We take those guys and then put them out scouting in the field. These guys were so well calibrated that they really knew if they're projecting a young player forward, what exactly has to change. And it was interesting because a lot of times scouting goes the opposite direction. It starts at amateur. Right. I think it's something that probably across all sports, something to think about, right? Is everyone staying on top of what big league baseball looks like? Because it changes too over time, right? The style of play changes as rules change and things like that, and just the player pools change. It seems like it'd be important, that skill, to be able to know and have that feel for what it should look like, to be able to apply it to what you're seeing as a scout or probably as a coach and probably in other ways. So that stood out to me that you mentioned that. No GM's getting in that seat with experience or expertise in all these areas, right? So there's always some reliance you have to have. Have you found that your philosophy around player evaluation, team building a winning culture, has that evolved already for you in these few years in a front office?
More than anything, it's probably made me double down a little bit on some of the characteristics or attributes that I really believe strongly in terms of what winning players look like. And it's, I've said this before, I say it publicly a lot, that it's not always about the most talent. It's about the right collection of talent. And you have to have the right role players. You have to have the right stars, but you have to have the right role players as well. And guys that understand their role on the team, and they're equally as important as the stars. And those guys can actually set the culture and the chemistry of the team more than anybody, because it's their sacrifice that leads to the success of the collective group. Your star players are going to be your star players, but what can you get out of everybody else and the role players around those star players that is going to set the team up for success? This team in 2023 confirmed that for me, and it's something I strongly subscribe to. And we'll continue to sacrifice a little bit of talent here and there for the right fits on the team, and so that's something that you feel even stronger about now, which is maybe part of the evolution of being, a general manager, is that you do evolve. And I feel that way. Maybe it's just we're coming off a winning season and it all worked out for us, but it was my experience as a player. And I saw it again this year with this team.
So before the season, so you're, again, first time as the number one going into the off season, what was your approach and how was it different than maybe the approach you guys had previous couple of years?
First of all, the groundwork and the foundation for our success had been really laid years in advance, even before my hires. John Daniels did a tremendous job of really setting the organization up for success. I think the day I was hired, our owner, Ray Davis, announced that we were going to go into a mini rebuild to really try to set the organization up for success moving forward. Now, that was the winter of 2020 before the 21 season. I'm not sure anybody expected that in 2 years we would have gone through this rebuild and become world champions. But a lot of that was because they could accelerate the rebuild through free agency and spending money, because JD had been very fiscally responsible, if not committing any long-term contracts at that point. So after the 21 season, 2021, we lost 102 games. We were a very bad team, and we knew we were going to be. It was equally as painful as we thought it would be going through that. It crushed me. I'd never been part of a 100-loss team in my playing career. And I remember the night we lost game number 100, I just sat in the suite by myself thinking, this is terrible. I never want to be part of something like this ever again. And I knew how bad it felt to the players, to the coaches, to our manager, Chris Woodward at the time. And it was a really, really painful thing. And so 22, we came back and we had signed Corey Seager and Marcus Simeon primarily as two pillars up the middle for us. We expected to take a step forward. We knew that we were still going to be short on pitching, but in the 22 season, I felt like we didn't take that step as far as I thought we could and should have in terms of our improvement. I think we made an 8-game improvement, went from 60 wins to 68 wins, but we still lost 94 games. And I think we lost a number of one-run games, which you can argue there's a lot of luck in one-run games. I think we found a lot of ways to lose one-run games that were outside of luck. So I did feel like this team was better than we had performed record-wise. But I didn't necessarily think that we were going to be world champions 1 year later. Now, there were a number of things that we did last offseason in terms of upgrading the team and specifically the starting pitching to go along with what I felt like was a pretty good offense in 2022. When we got the starting pitching last year, we took a huge step forward, and then over the course of the season really grew into what became a world championship team.
So the team was first place for most of the season. I have some injuries in the second half. You go into the trade deadline knowing some potential health issues with some of your pitcher. What was your thinking at the trade deadline?
At the trade deadline, it became pretty clear. And look, you were a part of a number of these discussions as you were consulting with us and helping me in a lot of different areas. So you know what our status was going into the trade deadline. Ultimately, we decided that while we had slumped a little bit going into the deadline, that we were a very good team and that this team had a chance to win and to do something special, but we were going to need to improve our pitching and specifically our starting pitching, and which is ironic because you would probably look back on the season and say our biggest weakness at that point was our bullpen. Yet we still continued to focus on our starting pitching. And the reason for that was because we felt like we had a couple injuries in the starting pitching staff. We knew that we were going to have to get through the second half, maybe sustaining another injury or two, and that we just didn't have the overall depth in our starting pitching. We felt like our bullpen would be better if we created stability in our starting rotation. We wouldn't need to rely on our bullpen as much. I think part of the struggles in the first half with our bullpen was simply that we had sustained some injuries and had to rely on them too much. And so if there was a way eventually to get in the second half where we were stronger with our starting pitching, it may set our bullpen up for a little more success. Now, that didn't manifest or come to fruition the way we had anticipated, but the starting pitching additions actually became critical for us in our second half as we got Max Scherzer, and then Jordan Montgomery, both of whom pitched incredibly well for us in the second half. And then Max got hurt before the playoffs, but Monty became just a huge piece of our championship team, and the way he performed, it was amazing. We don't win without those guys.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes it's just the market that tells you where to go, in the sense that, especially at the trade deadline, when oftentimes the relievers are getting the biggest returns. That's always been something that surprised me in the past, that people just feel like they're that one reliever away from getting over the hump. There's been times with the Red Sox we were trading John Lester, who was having a great season, and the market wasn't that robust for him. But Andrew Miller was a reliever, had a much better market, and we end up getting Eduardo Rodriguez. Sometimes those dynamics are at play, and maybe the guys that you're targeting out of the bullpen are going for much higher prices than you'd expect, and you'd rather pivot and get the starters that, like you said, could hopefully deepen things out and help the bullpen ultimately. The team does struggle a little bit in the second half. The Mariners also come on really strong. Was there ever a time that you thought you weren't going to make the playoffs?
Well, yeah. In the last series in Seattle, I knew we had our work cut out for us. We had to go in Seattle we finished the season there with a 4-game series, and we needed to win 1 of 4 just to clinch a playoff spot, and we needed to win 2 of 4 to win the division. Houston was finishing the season in Arizona against the Diamondbacks, and we needed to win 1 of 4 and Arizona win 1 of 3, or we needed to win 2 games in Seattle. And we knew Seattle was really good. They were playing great baseball. It was going to be a tough environment, and really we were lucky to scratch out 1 win there. Houston went into Arizona and swept Arizona, and so we ended up tying for the division. And Houston, because of our head-to-head record over the course of the season, they had the tiebreaker, and so they won the division, and we were the wild card and had to fly from Seattle to Tampa for the wild card round of the playoffs. So, but yes, that Seattle series, it hit me that there's a chance that we're not going to get it. Seattle, I did not take them for granted. I did not for any second believe that it was going to be easy to win even 1 game there. And fortunately, we were able to get 1, and that was what we needed.
So as that result comes in, and you're the wild card, you're no longer getting a bye. You're going to be having to go play in Tampa for the 3-game series. What's your mindset at that point, going into the postseason?
Really just 1 game at a time. It's cliche. You hear it all the time. Just getting in is what matters. We had a long flight from Seattle to Tampa. It's as far as you can go in baseball. And during that flight, we had a lot of time to think about it. And I remember when we landed, talking to one of our coaches, and he said, I know this isn't how we would script it, but it might be the perfect path for this team. And the way he categorized it was right. We didn't win the division. We made it hard on ourselves, but that's what this team seemed to do. And when things felt the hardest was when this team responded. And sure enough, that's really how it played out in the playoffs. We won 2 games in Tampa to advance to the division series against Baltimore. We flew from Tampa to Baltimore. So really it made it feel like about a 3-week road trip, because we had gone from Anaheim to Seattle, Seattle to Tampa, Tampa to Baltimore. And we won the 2 games in Baltimore to come home to play game 3 in Arlington, which was our first time home in about 2.5 weeks. Whatever happened in that time period, the team really came together. As I look back on it, the biggest thing that happened to us is health. We had so many injuries in the second half of the season, and really we didn't get our team back and healthy until the last week of the regular season. And then once we had everybody together, we really showed how good the team was.
Yeah, as you mentioned, that's quite a gauntlet. Tampa, Baltimore, and Houston to get to the World Series. Like you said, getting some key guys to return health-wise is huge, always big. What else did you learn about your club, though, during that run to the World Series?
Just their ability to compartmentalize and focus. They really didn't get ahead of themselves, and they continued to handle adversity extremely well. The Tampa series and the Baltimore series, there wasn't a ton of adversity. We just got really hot. We carried that into Houston, where we won the first 2 games of the championship series, and we came home with a 2-0 lead, feeling really good about ourselves. And Houston came into Arlington and really they put it on us. They won games 3 and 4 pretty easily, and then game 5 we were up late in the game, and Houston came back and had a ninth inning come from behind win to steal Game 5. And at that point, the team could have quit. It felt like all the momentum had gone back to the Astros. They were going home with home field advantage. They needed to win one of two in Houston. And we knew it was an extremely tough place to play, even though we had won the first two games down there. We knew going back it's going to be hard to win two games here. And again, the team just found a way to come together, to persevere. The resilience of the team, no task was too hard. And when things seemed at its hardest, that's when this team seemed to respond the most. And in turn, we went down to Houston. We won two games and went on to the World Series.
That Houston series is pretty amazing. To have such a devastating loss in Game 5, like you said, third straight loss. Now you're on the brink. After winning the first two on the road. There's a history of teams just folding, right? There's a reason why sweeps happen way more frequently than they should, objectively. Right. And I think you give up. You just feel so demoralized. To have that happen and lose in the way that they did and to bounce back, for me, maybe it's the growing up a Red Sox fan and watching the 86 World Series where it's like there's no way they can win Game 7 after falling apart in Game 6, and of course they don't. But you see a lot of that happen. Momentum's a tough thing, right, to kind of see in baseball because there's so many other factors. The cliche of momentum is only as good as your next starting pitcher type of thing. And that's true, but there's still a big mental aspect of it. And to lose in that way, I thought that was probably it. I was feeling pretty down, as someone that was, like you said, consulting with you, and just thought, wow, it's hard to see them recovering, but they did bounce back. It was really impressive, and then had a great World Series.
I've got a fun story I share about that. That Houston Game 5 was a Thursday afternoon game, and so we went home Thursday night. We had Friday off before resuming the series for Game 6 Saturday in Houston, and Friday we had a workout before flying down to Houston. I came in late. I said, I'm going to give the team some distance. I'm going to give the staff some distance. I'll come in closer to mid-workout. And so when I showed up that day, I went down in the coach's room, and there were some coaches in there. The workout was going on out on the field. And I said, hey, what's the mood of the group? And I was curious as to how the boys were responding. And they told me a great story of their hitters meeting that afternoon before the workout. And they said at the end of the meeting, Austin Hedges, who was really our third string catcher and on the playoff roster, he stood up in the meeting. At the end of the meeting, he said, hey, boys, this is going to make a great documentary one day. Hedgie was just a great leader for us and embraced his role as one of the clubhouse veterans and kept the mood light and loose and provided a lot of entertainment in those meetings, which I can't describe on this podcast. But nonetheless, when I heard the story of him standing up and saying that, and the group just taking on that mentality, I thought, we're going to go down to Houston and we're going to find a way to win two games. The team flushed it, and it helped having Montgomery and Evaldi on the mound in Games 6 and 7 as well. But the offense came to life, and we won those games.
That's a great story. You always have to have those guys that can keep it light at the time where it's most stressful. I'll wrap this up checking in where you're at now. We're late in the off season. Spring training is a couple weeks away. What are the lessons that you've learned that you took into this offseason as you look to defend your title?
It's a great question, Zach, and it's one that I really didn't have a ton of time to reflect on until recently. Again, it comes back to your question, were you prepared for the role? And I always had this idea that winning organizations do everything perfectly, that they're the best in every facet. And what I realized over the course of the year is that there are going to be imperfections, and there are areas that we're not perfect, but there are also areas that we excel very, very well. And don't expect everything to be perfect. Don't expect us to dominate every facet of what a baseball operations department looks like. Understand that we're going to be flawed, that we're not going to be the best at everything, but can we be the best in the areas that matter most? And can we double down on the things that we do well and use those strengths to our advantage? And it was a great lesson for me to see that we were not perfect, and we were able to win a championship. I think it gives me hope that we can improve in a lot of areas, and we should get better. But also, you can't continue to chase perfection constantly and get bogged down by certain things that maybe you're not as strong at as you are in other areas. As a pitcher, I always say pitch to your strengths. Well, build the team to your strengths as well. It was a great lesson for me. The other lesson too was that being able to just to pivot when necessary and understand that, like you said, we probably should have upgraded our bullpen more than we did, but we thought, one, the market was going to be there on the starting pitching, and two, you can never have enough starting pitching. And I didn't know how that was going to really manifest or materialize until we got into the playoffs and we had all of a sudden Andrew Heaney, Dane Dunning, and John Gray in the bullpen, who provided just huge innings for us and were key contributors to us winning the World Series. All starters who transitioned to the pen for the good of the team. But we were able to pivot when we read the relief pitching market and thought the better upgrades for our team were the starting pitchers. Those two things stand out for me as I reflect back on our 2023 season.
Makes sense. Good stuff. CY, thanks so much for your time, for your insight. I really do appreciate it. Thanks a lot, and best of luck defending the title.
I appreciate it, Zach. It's great talking to you, and thanks for all your help and contribution in terms of this past year, and I've really enjoyed the relationship and look forward to being on here again. Hopefully I'll be your first guest, but not your last.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Deconstructing Champions. I hope you enjoyed hearing two-time champion Chris Young talk about his time on the mound and in the front office. In our conversation, I thought Chris showed that he's self-aware, humble, reflective, and eager to learn. Those traits have already paid off for him, and they'll continue to serve him well as a leader. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the podcast, please share it with others. You can find me on all social media platforms at Zach Scott Sports. That's at Zach, Z-A-C-K, Scott Sports. If you work in a pro sports operation and need help getting the most value from your player data and people to make smarter decisions and win more, check out 4ringsports.com. That's F-O-U-R, ringsports.com. On the next episode of Deconstructing Champions, we'll dive into baseball's salary arbitration process. We'll walk through how it all works using Mookie Betts' 2018 hearing as a guide. This was a hearing that included a risky tactic that may have never been done before or since. Thanks once again to our guest, Chris Young, for his time and insights. I'll see you next time.